could see that we could spend several days with these people very easily. I'm intrigued by a number of the commonalities in the list that we've created here. We can't explore everything, but I want to explore at least 3 or 4 big areas. I want to come to the inequality issue, how that affects jobs, youth, and others. I want to come back to Canada strongly in a moment. But first I want to go on the international level and follow up a little bit with comments made by Gerd, by Richard, by Joe, and by Kari about what seems to me to be a rollback of what was work done over decades to reform aid, reform development assistance, to reform these patterns, to increasingly pay attention to people's organizations, to poverty eradication, to human rights. And now we see out of the Busan Conference in South Korea, the emergence of the BRIC countries, the new actors, in particular China, which I don't think has a particular agenda about human rights. I'm wondering if we are seeing a rollback of the reform agenda and we're seeing the emergence of new actors that lower the bar. Richard.
Well, there are several things that I think are happening globally. As you say, I think the issue is not just a rollback, but I think there is a new trend that is coming up. I mean, when you call China a new donor, they go up in arms and say they have been operating and partners with all countries for ages, even under communism. But I think right now the biggest challenge and the biggest problem is that countries like China and India and others have got this double identity of being both recipients of aid and being givers of aid. And I think that double identity can be something that they manipulate in ways which are convenient. For example, if they come to a country like Uganda, one of the things that usually happens is they do not speak to anybody else apart from the president and cut deals at that level. And then they are given all kinds of concessions in industries. And this has happened. If you look at the number of dictators who across East Africa who have got very good relationships with China and some of what are called the big countries, I think that in itself is worrying. And I think it's because the conditions under which they have built their own economies are not so much conditions that respect human life, that respect human dignity. And indeed, the problem is also that we have lots of literature and media, pumping the Chinese model down our throat as something good that has happened in the world. It's true that growth in China is huge, but growth without human rights, growth without human dignity, I think will still give you a bigger challenge later. So I think that I see is the issue. And even when you look at what Busan was, that Busan was a very good process, very progressive, but clearly it stood in the middle of a world where it wasn't clear who is the leader of these processes. So indeed, right now I think we don't have an architecture that is there for taking forward the Busan agenda usefully. So I think we are still grappling with how do we deal with the world that is changing, has got very many power centers, and I think that's the issue to engage with. So,
Richard, I wonder if you might follow this because you did mention Canada. I wonder, is there a connection between the emergence of China on the development aid scene? Yes. And what that means for Canada. Does it make it easier for the Harper government, for example, to say, well, the ODA Accountability Act is irrelevant, human rights are not as relevant, look at China, what they do, how they do it. Does that in turn affect the environment for civil society?
Yeah, before I come to your question, I want to react to something you said initially in your first question to Richard. For China, I think we need to be a little careful about criticizing Chinese on human rights grounds, and to suggest that they're lowering the bar, I'm not sure that's fair. The Chinese are concerned, they don't like Harper or Cameron or anybody else lecturing them on human rights, because of course the concern with our governments is a focus on political and civil rights, what we call first generation rights. The Chinese and those who are promoting the idea of South-South cooperation are saying, look, we're focused on economic, social, and cultural rights, so don't lecture us on civil rights. And of course, you've had Olivier de Souter here recently who issued a report, a very damning report on Canada, and the way it's treating its Aboriginal people, its Indigenous people, and the level of poverty in this country. And that's an issue of economic and social rights. So the Chinese can just as easily turn around and say, hey, you have your own problems, don't start lecturing us. Which is not to say that having more political and civil rights would be beneficial. Obviously it would, and there is a process of evolution taking place, and we all hope that there will be changes in China. But it's not just China. I mean, they are, with India and Brazil, are talking about principles of South-South cooperation. This was talked about a lot in Busan. I too was present in Busan. And in fact, one of a much stronger advocate of South-South principles is Brazil. Brazil has taken a much tougher line publicly on what South cooperation means and the principles. So I think we've got to be careful about suggesting that somehow the Chinese alone are lowering the bar. The bar is already pretty low, and we're contributing to that as well. And we could have done a lot more in the past as aid agencies, including CEDA, including USAID, including the bank, for example, in examining the extent to which economic and social rights can be used as an instrument for development to hold governments to higher levels of accountability. We haven't done that. Aid agencies haven't done that, and we could do that, and we should be doing that, frankly. So I think we need to be a little careful about assigning blame, so much blame to the Chinese. Now, to come back to Canada, what was your original question?
I wanted to know if this lower bar, as you say, not explicitly, not directly only China's responsibility, but also many other actors, how does that affect civil society?
Well, I think it poses challenges for civil society, and clearly in countries like China and some governments in Africa are making it more difficult for civil society organizations to work freely and effectively. There was a period when institutions like the World Bank, I was involved in some of these things in both Cameroon and in Bosnia and Herzegovina, where we were promoting the idea of the governments putting in place legislation to allow civil society organizations to be created and to protect them and ensure that they could operate freely within the law, because many countries didn't have that kind of legislation in place, so they could, whatever they wanted, make it difficult for civil society organizations to operate. That still exists in some countries, unfortunately. But the bigger problem in terms of Canada is that I think we have a government which views the world very differently from past governments. And we as a research institute, to some extent, have been feeling this because they are, as I said earlier, their view is that development is best promoted and best supported through trade and investment, especially by large multilateral organizations, especially by Canadian mining companies, for example. And so they promote very actively, proactively, the role of Canadian extractive companies. And I think there is a role for Canadian CSOs to shed some light on the way extractive companies, Canadian companies, operate, especially in low-income countries, and especially in sub-Saharan Africa, where you have the majority of low-income countries are there, some 39 of the 60 classified, I think it's 60 now, as low-income are there, and they're much more vulnerable to the misbehavior of large private companies than middle-income countries, for example, who have the financial capacity, the human capacity to deal with them. And I think for Canadian CSOs, it's important to begin to look at the role of this more mercantilist approach to development, and to start. I mean, Julia and I have talked about this. We need a new narrative on development, I think, and we need to start thinking about what that narrative should be, and why international development, as Gerd has described it today, is critically important for the average Canadian. I think that's been lost with this new.
Let me bring Gerd in and see his comments on the emergence of China, the private sector as the engine of development.
Yes. Well, I always like to look at the opportunity side of things and not just the risk side. And when you look at what China, just to quote one example, it's not the only country out there, it's not the only new emerging country. Let's look at China and what they're doing in Africa. I would agree that, yes, they don't seem to care very much about rights in pushing their economic activity, but I would put to you that that's not why they're there in the first place. China never went to Africa to promote rights. China went to Africa to look after its own economic interests, and it is to some extent open to allowing economic interests of others, namely the African states. And within Africa, the view isn't completely uniform on what to make of the Chinese presence. So what you asked about the role of civil society organizations, I would put to you that one big role for CSOs in the picture is to look for any possible openings. You know, the Chinese or anybody else who is, you know, multinational corporations who operate, Canadian multinational operations who operate in Africa, they may not be this juggernaut that they're made out to be. They may be prepared to change their ways, or if they're not prepared to, they may be pushed to change their ways. So one important role for civil society organizations would be to look for any crevices, to look for any openings, maybe to look for parties inside of these companies, same thing in government bureaucracies, to make these changes happening, and then to slowly widen those fissures that may already exist. That may be pretty tough and very hard to do, but if you accept my premise that, say, China isn't in Africa to oppress people in the first place, that's not the goal of why they're there. They're in the country to get raw materials, to promote their own economies, etc., etc. So that may open some room for rights-based approaches as well. I'm not saying that's going to be easy, but that would open a role for civil society organizations in the picture, and also for Canadian civil society organizations supporting them, coming up with proposals, thinking through different scenarios, that sort of thing.
And Kari.